Hello the internet. In this video we're going to go through changing the passenger side or right side valve cover gasket and VCT solenoid in a late model 2007 Ford F-150 with a 5.4 V8 3-valve engine. And the reason I'm talking about the late model is that it is sort of significant because in earlier 2007 models, you were able to change the VCT solenoid without taking the valve cover gasket off. There was a gasket you could pry up, and then with some careful screwdriver insertion, you would be able to remove the VCT solenoid and leave the valve cover in place. That is what I initially thought I could do, and then discovered that I could not, and that it required me taking off the valve cover to do this. So because I had to do that, I went ahead and changed out the gaskets on the valve cover. I did see a video of someone actually getting at this through the gasket for the VCT solenoid, because there is one, but you're very likely going to mangle it, and I'm not entirely sure that you would actually be able to get it out. It seemed like they were, but I don't know that it's any better than doing it this way. So as you can see from this image, we've got the VCT solenoid, the old one, out and compared to the new one, and in the upper left you see the new blue valve cover gasket. So let's get started. So first thing that I did was remove the ECU. You've got these three plugs that you can unsnap, and you'll see that there are, where my finger is pointing, there are some bolts. I think they're 10mm. I'm not entirely sure if I'm remembering correctly, but remove those, pull that out after you unsnap the three connectors. And then behind that you have a bracket that also needs to come out because it hangs down and is in the way. I think that's the same bolts. I create a parts line, so everything that I take off that's big and significant I put in line in the order in which it was taken off. Put it under my truck so that if I'm walking around the garage I don't step on it, but as you can see here I took off the intake and then I'm also putting the ECU, which is next in line. So there's just going to be connectors. I found that all the connectors were keyed and shaped differently, so I wasn't too concerned about like unplugging some things and then not being able to plug them back in. So I took pictures anyway to make sure that I did not forget any, or if I got confused where something went, I could refer to that. So there's also a vacuum hose on this side. Snaps on two ends. You see the little green tab. You stick your finger or a screwdriver, press that down, it pops right out. Got one. It connects up here at the top, at the back of the motor by the firewall, and then down onto the valve cover itself. Again, it goes into my parts line. You can see that I'm building it back to front. More connectors. I undid the positive battery terminal. I did not do this for electrical or electrocution reasons, although that's probably pretty smart. I just needed this wire out of the way. Almost everything unsnaps an electrical connector, so I don't think it's a big deal if you didn't unscrew it, but I removed the battery too because it just gave me more room. So it's not a huge amount of effort to do, and it's definitely worth it for trying to get that valve cover out. Also, you'll notice that I wired it to the hose, the coolant hose, just to keep it out of the way and keep it from falling back down. So next, removed this coolant hose, and this turned out to be a huge major pain. I'll talk about that a little bit later. The little tool that I'm pointing at is an invaluable tool. I think it cost 20 bucks at AutoZone, or maybe 30, I don't know. It's definitely been worth it. It unsnaps coolant lines and the little metal pressure tabs. It's made specifically for that. It's got a wire. You can get it in funky places. It's an amazing tool, and it's worth the purchase. So I got the coolant line off. You can see that I tried to prevent it from leaking. This was ultimately a failed attempt. I will talk maybe a little more about it further in the video. But it continued to leak. I continued to have problems with it. I continued to mop up. And you should just remove the coolant line, let that drain out. You'll lose a little bit of coolant. It's totally worth doing because this was such a pain. Okay, so at this point you can see that I have removed the ignition coils. You can see the holes where those insert. You don't need to remove the spark plugs, leave those in fact. That way things like coolant that might leak doesn't drop into the engine. So, and then I added the ignition coils onto my parts line. Okay, another connector. This is a shot from underneath the passenger side, behind the passenger side front wheel. And you can see in the center there, it's just a picture of the very last, or the very furthest bottommost bolt that is part of the valve cover. And I'm just pointing this out because I ended up coming up through here to get at this one because it's kind of difficult to get to from the top, but there is room. It is kind of nice, and it was actually this little gap here was actually really handy when I was putting the valve cover back on because I could see when the gasket kind of had pried out, and I could reach up and push it back into the groove where it was supposed to be. But I did use this also to get at this bolt, so just pointing that out. So I used an extender and a wobble head, and I think it's an 8mm, looks like, to remove the valve cover bolts. Mostly accessible. Trucks, this particular truck anyway, seems to have pretty good accessibility, or for the most part. Okay, so we have the valve cover is started to unbolt it. I also removed this is the holder for the battery. I probably could have worked around it. It was just a little bit of extra obstacle, so I removed it because it made it a little bit easier. Okay, so once I unbolted all of the valve cover bolts, you can see that they stay in place, but they're loose. If you look at the one on the lower right arrow, you can see that one's actually pried up a little bit. I used a screwdriver to kind of pop the valve cover. It kind of, over time it heats and fuses slightly to the gasket, but it's not big. It should pop up without a whole lot of effort. And I just wanted to point out that I had advanced my attempt at preventing coolant leak. This again failed. You can see the zip ties I left it overnight. This was a multi-day project for me, and overnight it pooled, so don't even bother with this. Just pry off the big fat coolant hose, let it drain out till there's no more coolant running that will pressure itself out of that particular nozzle. And as you can see, this is the coolant. I tried to spare myself the mess, but ultimately failed. So I would recommend not bothering. And here's me removing the coolant hose to let it drain. Things are better now. Got a little dry rag under there just to make sure, because at this point I was a little bit sensitive that it might be leaking. I would leave it and it would leak, so I left it there until I was sure it was dry. And I'm starting on the harness with wiring that goes into the ignition coils. I was hoping to leave this on. It plugs in below the motor. It's kind of a pain to reach. So I was kind of hoping to leave it on when I pulled the gasket off, but it was just too tight, and so I had to remove it. So there's this plug towards the front of the engine, and then this is a shot underneath. This is where it actually runs to and plugs in underneath. So you've got to kind of climb underneath, pry it off here, and then you can just move the whole thing out of the way. And then all that wet is the coolant that got everywhere. Okay, so this is kind of the elephant in the room for the right side, and other videos have talked about this. And I left the coolant line in, and there is also the oil checking tube, which is maybe even more difficult to get at. That one, it was a pain, but it was kind of workable. The AC line, the top line with that little bend in it, that proved to be a major pain. Less getting it off, more getting it on, especially because I had decided to paint my valve cover and make it pretty, and it rubbed against this and made some scratches. So, but this is the big hurdle for this whole effort. And in retrospect, I would recommend taking your truck down to your local shop, having them drain the AC fluid, and then just take this off, like literally, like the 2 bolts. The biggest problem is taking the coolant out. I think if there is a local service, they would pay like for maybe it's $50 or something. They would drain it, they would hold the AC fluid for you, and then when you come back, they would repressurize everything. And if I were to do this again, I would do that. This just turned out to be more work than it was actually worth. But as you can see here, I've already pried off the valve cover. You can see the old gasket. And here it is after I'm pulling the gasket off. And then I always take the new parts and compare it with the old parts and just make sure that what I got was what I expected. And so the black gasket and the blue gasket are the replacement pair, and so they have all the right shape and width and all that, so that was good. Next, you want to clean off the engine where the valve cover gasket mates, so it'll get dirty over time. We use a razor, kind of like gently scrape, you know, at a very gentle angle. You don't want to scar it up, but like scrape off all the gross stuff that you can. I use some brake cleaner or carb cleaner actually, and then, you know, rub it clean so it's nice and shiny. So this is not obviously a step that you have to do. Since I had it off and it was out, I thought I might as well like give it a nice new look with some black high heat paint. So I took it outside and did that. The other thing that's probably smart to do is check your timing chain. So just kind of give it a like visual inspection. Check the tension. The top tension should be good. It'll be looser on the bottom. There's these plastic guides on the bottom. Those will break. You can see kind of down if you were to look under the underside and kind of poke around in there. You'll see like if they're in good shape. Mine were, but I've seen like they will break and then you'll have that timing chain clatter. And there's other videos talking about that. But you got all this off, so like it's kind of pays to do this check too. And if something's broken, then you know you're already halfway there. Okay, so new gasket going on. I put a little bit of RTV gasket maker just kind of in the groove where it goes. It kind of helps hold it in place. Not so much to like give it better seal, but to just make sure that when you're putting it on, it kind of like sticks to the valve cover and doesn't fall out, because when you're banging it around in there, especially if it's tight like it was for me because of the AC line, then it's definitely worth a little bit of extra help. Okay, you've seen this shot already, but again, I compare the new parts with the old parts. In this case, I'm comparing the VCT solenoid, and they are the same. My old ones were actually pretty good shape, so I had some knocking, or not some knocking, I had some behaviors where after like a hard drive, like say up a hill or a mountain, I would get to the top and then it would get down to idle and it would kind of like run rough, and then it would sometimes shut off, and that's kind of indicative of a VCT valve not doing its job correctly. So even though mine looked okay, I felt like it was worth replacing. I have tested since then and I have not had that problem, so I feel like this did solve it, even though they looked to be in pretty good shape. I guess a lot of times the screens will be plugged up or they'll be torn and then they're not getting directing the oil pressure correctly, but So anyway, made a comparison, and honestly, this was like the reason I did this whole job, and it was the least amount of work. It took 30 seconds literally to pull the old one out, put the new one in. It's a single Torx bolt that you yeah, just screw back down, hand tighten, and leave. Also worth checking your camshafts to make sure everything looks okay. I think mine were okay. There's a little bit of like discoloration, but I am not having any issues, so I'm not a total expert there, but things kind of looked okay from what I could tell. Okay, so replacing the valve cover gasket. There's a seam at this point where the two arrows are. You want to put a little RTV gasket maker over that before you put the valve cover back on. So here's my attempt to make it a little less painful to seat the valve cover gasket. I pulled the AC line back, connected it with zip tie, and was trying to keep it pried up out of the way. I got maybe ½ an inch. Honestly, it was brutal, and this did not really work quite well. So like I said, if you can remove this, go ahead and remove it. It'll just make your life a lot easier. So got the valve cover back on. You can see where from this angle it doesn't look that bad, but kind of like straight on it was more scraped. There's actually a further scrape further back, but that was all from the AC line of trying to get it on, and so my nice paint job got a little bit gummed up. No worries, I had some of this left. I sort of like shielded around it and just sprayed it and touched up the little spots, so worked out okay, but yeah. And here it is, back in. This is the line to the harness that plugs into the ignition coils. The one that I had to go underneath to get. Well, I broke the tab because these tabs get hardened and over time, and so they're brittle. And then when you like unplug stuff, it's kind of a fight, and there's dirt and whatever, and so I broke it. So you can see a little bit of red there. That is RTV gasket maker. I have found this to be invaluable for broken tabs. So I put some of that on the insert and put it in, and I've checked it. Like this has been a couple months since I did this, and for making the video, and it's rock solid. So no need to be too concerned if you've got a little bit of RTV gasket maker. It works really well. And here we are. Got the shiny new black valve cover on. I got a new VCT solenoid, new gasket, and we're ready to rock. And that's it. Thanks.